All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Connect session. Today's topic is going paperless with Sage Intacct. So I wanted to present on this topic, not just because it's always a good topic, but it's a particularly notable topic for the times we live in right now in the COVID-19 environment. I've already had a lot of clients have interest in going paperless when it comes to purchases and payments and storage of their documents inside of Intacct, and so that kind of inspired that was my inspiration for the topic today. So pretty much we're going to go through and have a discussion on a few slides here, and then I'm going to show a short demo about what you can do inside of Intacct when it comes to automating and digitizing your approval workflows. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the presentation here. So one of the things that I presented on earlier this year as part of a normal CPE for lunch is I talked about how we're transitioning into a bit more of a digital. We're undergoing a digital finance transformation. Fewer things are being processed through paper. Fewer things are manual processes, and over time, over this next decade, we're going to be leaning more and more on digital technologies to do our work in a finance department. So and really, COVID-19 has really been the catalyst to prompt firms and companies to evaluate what they're doing with paper and their quasi-paper processes. And in my case, in my definition, a quasi-paper process is just like shooting off emails to people saying, hey, do you approve this? Yeah, I approve it, and downloading everything and all that. That's kind of a quasi-paper process because it's still a lot of manual intervention to get the job done. And emails can still be lost in the shuffle. So everything was already kind of trending that way back in January of this year. But once COVID-19 hit, it kind of changed the landscape. It's accelerated some things, and it has been the catalyst for some change and has necessitated a lot of firms to adopt or look at adopting new procedures. So one of the reasons why a lot of folks are looking to switch to digital processes and digital approval workflows is really with remote work environments becoming. I know that once people start going back to the office, this is going to become less common, but still there's going to be some firms that are going to have people who maybe start working more remotely. That normalization is already kind of occurring. So remote work environments currently prevent really good desk-to-desk movement of documents. So digitizing that process takes away the whole, I'll set a folder on your desk, sign this stuff, and then I'll pick it up from your desk and go from there. One of the other problems with paper is that even if you have all these signed documents, you still kind of have a faulty paper trail, because you could have certain documents, source documents, approval, signatures, stuff like that. They can all kind of get lost in the shuffle, right? So like I said before, you leave a folder on a desk, a gust of wind comes in, it slips the paper out, or something gets, or a piece of paper gets overlooked and it gets shredded, and without someone really looking at it, anything can happen, right? And because of that, if you use a paper process, you don't have a full chain of the paper trail that you can tie back to a transaction in your accounting system. So, and in relation to that, even if you have a really good paper filing mechanism, when it comes time to audit, when it comes time to have an audit, or whether it's external or internal, you need to pull supporting documentation for transactions in your accounting system. So even if you have a really good paper filing system, you still need to dig through lots and lots of paper to find the exact source documentation to tie back to the transaction in your accounting system. So those are all pretty antiquated paper processes. Now they've served businesses well for quite some time, but like I said before, the landscape is changing. More things are going to be done remote. More things are going to be done digitally. So you want to make sure that you're staying ahead of the curve when it comes to those changes. Okay, so we've already talked about how paper is kind of an antiquated process. So what can you get out of Intacct, right? So all of you are here today, most likely because you are already on Intacct. And at the very least, you just have a native core subscription to Intacct. And with that core subscription, you get high security, unlimited cloud storage. So everything you attach to your transactions and your records inside of Intacct, they're kept at state-of-the-art data centers in geographically diverse locations with redundant backups, et cetera, et cetera. So Intacct also has configurable approval workflows to fit a wide variety of approval needs for your business. And once again, relating back to the prior slide, is when you are utilizing Intacct as your document storage system and your document storage system and your workflow approval system, all the transactions that you all the attachments that you bring in and tag to your transactions, that's a direct link to those transactions. So gone are the days where you find a transaction in Intacct and you try to find the paper records associated with it. You don't have to do that because the attachments are put directly on the transaction themselves. And you can access that whether you're drilling down from a report or you're going to a list of your bills. It's all there right at your fingertips. And by the way, that will save you time on your audit because it will take the auditors fewer, it'll require them to do less legwork to track down all the transactions, and it'll reduce your time, your staff's time with helping them find those transactions as well. In addition, Intacct also has complete logging of every approval and every decline that happens on a transaction. So let's just say you have a purchase where, let's just say it's a big significant purchase. It needs to go through the department head, it has to go through the site manager, and it has to go through someone at finance. If that particular purchase has to pass through that chain of people multiple times because of whatever reason, all the approvals and declines and the comments of each person, they are permanently linked to that transaction. So we'll go ahead and show a little bit of this, or a truncated version of it when we do our demo. But it's really nice to be able to pull up a transaction from 3 years ago or a year ago and be able to see, oh yeah, this went to so-and-so who approved it, but it got declined by this other person because of this reason. Right, so all that information is kept inside of Intacct directly on the transaction. So that's really cool. So finally, the majority of this webinar is going to be spent discussing more like bill entry and purchasing approvals, and digitizing those, making those paperless. Intacct also, native Intacct has, it can produce standard ACH files for your bank. So if you are in conversations with your bank, or if you'd like to have conversations with your bank about doing ACH instead of checks, Intacct can handle those as well. So that is another thing. I've also had clients engaging with us to see, hey, we want to get away from printing checks. We want to start doing ACH. How do we go about it? So if you're not doing that already, Intacct does have the ability to do that. And I said it before already in the at the beginning of this slide, but all these features, if you currently have Intacct, you already have the ability to deploy these features at no additional cost to your core subscription. It's already included in your core Intacct subscription, and you could use you could start using all of these features today. and not have to pay a dime in additional subscription costs. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to do before we dove into the demonstration is I wanted to lay out a little bit of a map about what we would talk with you about if you just gave us a call and said, like, hey, Wes, or hey, Mike, we want to talk about going paperless inside of Intacct. And these are some of the things that we would talk about if we were to have a meeting to figure out what your needs are, what your long-term vision is, etc. Okay, so I'm going to walk through all these different steps here. So the first step is, if you're not doing so already, a prerequisite to going paperless inside of Intacct is you have to use attachments, right? So you probably noticed on most of your different records inside of Intacct, especially your the attachment field is the most obvious on transactions. Most transactions inside of Intacct should have a little box, a little drop down that says attachments. So in order to really go paperless with Intacct, you have to be utilizing that field. Now, it's just as simple as dragging and dropping the files directly onto that field, and it'll automatically attach, and you can go through your business from there. And like I said, supporting documents for transactions, those are supported as attachments inside of Intacct, but also vendors support attachments as well. Maybe you have a master services agreement or for your vendors, or you just want to make sure every vendor has a W-9. You can take like a PDF of their W-9 and drag and drop it onto their vendor record, and it's there forever. So no longer do you have a little filing cabinet with all of your vendor W-9s. They're directly inside of Intacct. And just like with W-9s on vendors, if you have contracts, if you're doing AR billing inside of Intacct, and if you are the type of company that has contracts with their customers, maybe consider having their contract attached to their customer record, And that helps. Once again, that really helps get rid of the whole paper idea, and all that information is kept for whoever needs to see it. And like I said before, attaching documents to transactions or records on Intacct is as simple as just dragging and dropping. And you can drag multiple files onto a single record, which I will be showing you in a little bit. One other thing when it relates to attachments, and maybe you've had a little bit of experience with this already, but when you decide to use attachments, you can utilize what are called smart rules to make attachments required. So if you're not familiar with them, smart rules are pretty much user-defined validation rules that you can put inside of Intacct to help enforce that your staffers are entering in all the fields they need to, and that everything is complete. And just like with, and like I mentioned before, if you put attachments on records, you can drill down from any report to see them. So you can drill down into a super large, you can drill down from a consolidated balance sheet or a consolidated income statement, and drill down to an individual transaction and pull up its supporting documentation. So that is step one that we would walk you through. All right, step two would be, we would talk through what exactly you want to pass through an approval process. So most of the time when clients engage us, especially, the main thing they want to talk about is we want to think about doing purchase orders or requisitions, or we want to try doing more in regards to using module and having some robust approvals built into there. Now, I say that that's one of the big things that gets brought by clients, is because most of the time with something like payments, that's typically something that is implemented from the get-go, because most people going on to Intacct, they generally will have a two-step verification process for payments going out. But if you don't have payment approvals inside of Intacct, you can assign approval levels to those as well. And then finally, this isn't used as much, but once again, we do have a handful of clients using them, is you can also utilize journal entry approvals. So if you want to make sure that the journal entries that your staffers are putting in get reviewed by the controller or the CFO, those journal entries can go through a simple approval process that your CFO or controller will then approve and have them post. There are some limitations to this because once a journal entry gets approved, you can't really change it. And there's reasons for that from an auditability standpoint. But that is one word of caution, is if you want to implement journal entry approvals inside of Intacct, you just have to bear in mind that once a journal entry is approved, you can't really change it. Okay. Step 3 would be that we would just determine, well, after we would determine what exactly you want to put approval workflows behind, is we would determine what type of approval logic you would like to apply to all these transactions. So once again, I'm going to be honing in more on the purchasing module, where you can have the requisition to purchase order to invoice type of workflow, or you could even just do a purchase order to invoice, or just an invoice workflow. So I'm going to hone in on some of the approval logics you have available in that module, but you can assign dollar value thresholds so that, like, a bill comes in or a requisition comes in, it's under $100, doesn't really need to be approved. It's just automatically approved because it's pretty small stuff. You don't really need to sweat it. But of course, my philosophy is, especially if you're trying to do fraud prevention, try to keep that. I like to see if clients just want to approve everything, but once again, that all depends on what your preference is. Okay, but then you can also set up a dollar value threshold between $1 and $500, where, oh, person A will approve that. But then if it's $500 plus, person A and person B need to approve it. So that's a pretty basic dollar value progressive threshold type of setup there. Another common one, and in fact, this is the one I'm going to be demonstrating today, is assigning managers to a department and then having the department manager be the approver. So that's the one that we're going to talk about today. One thing to note, and one of the things that I always like to bring up whenever someone asks me about potentially doing purchasing workflows and approvals, you can get pretty creative with a bunch of different combinations of approval logics and like multiple approvers and things like that. However, I've found in my experience that a little goes a long way with approvals. And really, at the end of the day, Intacct is a robust mid-market accounting system, but it's also more, when you compare it to something like an SAP or something like that, it's a little bit more out of the box. And because it's a little bit more out of the box, you can't do everything you want. And what I mean by that is, if you have a type of, if the approval logic you want is like, oh, if it's for this vendor and this amount, it needs to go to this person, and that person. But if it's for a different vendor for the same amount, then it goes to like 3 other people in varying combinations. So my point about this is Intacct's workflows can accomplish a lot. But one of the things to think about, especially when you're formulating what you want your internal processes to be, is how can we utilize what Intacct does best and kind of build our approval workflows around what Intacct handles really well. So just wanted to throw that out there. And if you are thinking about implementing something like this, and you're wondering, does Intacct super easily support this type of workflow? Once again, feel free to send us off a note to support@mainersolutions.com, and we can talk with you a little bit more on that. So step 4 is totally the easiest part. And I was being sarcastic there, but we are going to, I'll walk through a few implementation steps here. The implementation process is something that you do need to put some technical things in place to really get it to work correctly for you. But it's really all configurable through your purchasing module and AP and general ledger module configs. So we're going to be talking about some of the individual pieces you have to set up under purchasing, but for the most part, if you go into purchasing and set up an approval policy and link to the appropriate transaction type or the transaction definition, that's for the most part all you have to do to define an approval workflow inside of Intacct. Now, there's a little bit more that you need to do than that, and that's why I provided a link to the purchasing help file out on the handout provided as part of this webinar. And like what Justin said, the handout is going to be available on the Connect portion of the Mainer Solutions site. So purchasing for the most part is, in addition to the purchasing module config, the config screen, you set up approval policies and then link to the transaction definitions to get that all set up. For AP bills and AP payments, everything is configured through the AP module configuration. So that's pretty simple. Just like that, if you want to set up journal entry approvals, you can just utilize the GL module config. The GL module config screen, there's a little matrix where you can set up journal by journal, who you want to approve entries in what journal. And the standard ACH does, it's not difficult to set up, but you do have, there are some more technical fields that you have to fill out. Once again, I did provide a link to the standard ACH setup file on the Intacct help file. And once again, if you're interested in implementing Intacct ACH files, you're going to want to reach out to your bank first to find out what their requirements are. And then sometimes based on their requirements, and they'll typically send you a PDF for it, based on their requirements, you'll be able to pretty easily correlate, oh, this field inside of Intacct equals this field on the ACH file, and then you get instructions for your bank as to how to fill that out. And I already mentioned that Intacct Help gives you all the instructions you may need. And we have links on the handout. And once again, even though Intact's help file gives you pretty much everything you need to implement these things, if you have questions about implementing these things, you can always feel free to send us off a note and just say, hey, we want to roll out purchasing, or we want to roll out approval workflows in this module. You can feel free to send us off a note at really any point in your implementation. Now, I will give a warning or a caution. If you want to self-implement the purchasing module, once again, you certainly the help gives you everything you need for that. But if you try to self-implement purchasing and you go into the purchasing module configuration, there is a checkbox that says enable advanced workflow. Now, if that box is already checked, no problem. You don't have to do anything. But if you go into the purchasing module config and the advanced workflow enabled checkbox is unchecked, you want to be very, very careful before you check that, because once you check that box, it does fundamentally change. It does a permanent fundamental change to the way that your order entry module, your purchasing module, and your inventory module behave. So be very, very careful when you get to that point. And once again, feel free to send us off a note if you have any questions related to that. Okay, we are going to go into a live demonstration about core Intacct purchasing, and just how, first of all, how to do some of the implementation steps, not in super detail, but just to give you a high-level overview about the little setup pieces. And then we'll also do a little bit of a demo about some of the functionality of it. Okay, so I'm inside of Intacct right now. So I have 3 tabs open. So I have the first tab here, and notice that I'm logged in as myself. You can think of me in this webinar, I'm going to be the AP coordinator, right? I'm going to be inputting the bills. I'm going to be the one who's following up on them, make sure they get approved. And then at the end of the day, I'm going to be the one who pays them and all that good stuff. On one of my other tabs, I have a person called Approver 1. So this person is going to be just one of my approvers, right? So you can think of this person as the manager of a particular department or a set of departments. And then I have Approver 2, who is the department manager of an entirely different set of departments. So the way that I have the approval workflow set up inside of Intacct in this instance is whenever I put in a bill, it's going to be automatically routed to the department manager that the transaction is for. So depending on how much time we have, I may do some more advanced stuff, kind of passing between the 2 approvers here. But if we run short on time, we may just use Approver 1 here. But anyway, like I said, before we get into the actual transacting portion of this, I did want to point out some of the high-level config steps that you need to think about when you want to put purchasing and purchase requisition, purchase order, or vendor invoices, getting those all set up for approval workflows. Like I said, we're going to be working inside of the purchasing module. So most of the time, so just a little bit of high-level config that you have to do is if you're an administrator of your Intacct system, you should have a config option for all of your, a configuration button for all of your modules, right? So under purchasing, under setup, there's going to be a configuration link that you hit. And then as you scroll down, there's a whole bunch of checkboxes you could potentially set up for your preferences. But I'm going to get down to the point here. And there's a section called Approvals where you then check these boxes. First of all, you check this box to enable or disable purchasing approval. And you can also, if you're doing something like purchase requisitions, you can also require a vendor for approval or not. Because when you're doing requisitions, if someone puts in a requisition that says, hey, I need like 100 boxes worth of whatever item it is, and I don't really care where we get it from, I just need it. So they don't necessarily need to fill out a vendor. But of course, once you convert it into a bill downstream, you're going to need a vendor. You're going to need a vendor. There's also a checkbox that asks whether you want to require a brand new approval cycle if an approved transaction is modified. I have this unchecked in this instance, but best practice I would say would be to check this because especially if you change like a dollar amount or like a dimension or something like that, you want to make sure that it gets reapproved and it has that full cycle of changes made to it. And then there's this checkbox that says email notifications. Most of the time you want to send off emails to your people when they have something to approve. And then over here, here's a button that says enable approval policies. We're going to get into that in just a moment. But one thing I wanted to point out, since I brought it up earlier, is there is a single checkbox under advanced settings that says enable advanced workflow. So in this instance, I already had it enabled, and notice how I can't change it. If you see this already, it's perfectly fine. There is a reason you were set up that way. But if this is unchecked, you want to, like I said, be very, very careful, because it does fundamentally change the way in which your distribution modules, your order entry, purchasing, and inventory control, it fundamentally changes how those work. So be very, very careful. But okay. Getting back to the approval policies up here, if I click Manage, this is going to show me all of my transaction types that have some type of approval logic behind them. So in this case, the ones I'd like to call out in particular is I have a transaction type called purchase requisition that I currently have routed to route to the employees manager. So if someone puts in a purchase requisition, that person's manager, direct manager, gets an email saying, hey, you've got to approve this. The one I'm going to be utilizing today is the second one for vendor invoice. So I'll go ahead and expand my screen here. So under here, my transaction type of vendor invoice is selected, and I'm going to select a rule type. So the one I chose was transaction department approval, which means whatever department the transaction is for, it's going to route to that person's manager or that department's manager. There are a whole bunch of different rule types here, like ones based on value, ones based on locations or entities, and then you can also tag named people, right? So maybe your organization has their desire is to just it doesn't matter what the bill is for. If a bill gets put in, it always goes to this person, and you can very easily do that. One other thing I would like to call out is notice how I can add additional rows to my approval policy. So this allows you to build multiple steps into the approval policy. So I'm not going to save, but let's just say a transaction, an invoice gets put in by the AP person. It gets routed to that bill's department manager. And then after it gets routed and approved by the department manager, then it goes to the location manager or the entity manager, right? So if each one of your locations has 5 departments, it makes sense potentially to first route it to the department manager, and then it goes to the overseer of the entire location's operations. And then maybe you want to then have it route, then maybe have the last step be it hits your CFO or someone in the admin department approves it. So the cool thing about utilizing something like this is it saves the approve and decline history for each bill throughout each one of the steps, right? So it clearly states, yeah, this person approved it, but this person didn't. They sent it back, and then it went through the process again. So like I said, I'm not going to save that because I want to keep things pretty simplistic here, but multi-step stuff like that is possible, and it can be applicable in certain situations. Okay, so we already talked about approval policies. One of the other foundational pieces of the this is of the purchasing module are the transaction definitions. So with transaction definitions, you can just think of them as like a transaction type, right? So We're not going to be using all of these today, but notice how there's like a blanket purchase order, there's a normal purchase order, there's purchase requisitions, there's vendor invoices, so on and so forth. These are all of the different types of transactions you can build. And as part of these transactions, when you're setting them up, you get to define what their workflows are. Like I can explicitly say, oh, my purchase requisition is my first step, and then you can convert a purchase requisition to an order, and then you can convert the order into an invoice. So that way you have that connectivity across all three transactions. So just to lay out a little bit of a graphical workflow here, under transaction definitions under purchasing, I check the box for display workflows, and I can see here a little miniaturized version of my workflow. So it shows that my purchase requisition is my first step, and that gets turned into an order. And then this instance must be utilizing some commitment encumbrance accounting, but that may not be applicable to you at all. But ultimately, it ends as a vendor invoice, or that's the normal end of the vendor invoice. But in the event where you need to create a debit memo based off of the transaction, you can convert it into a debit memo and then just get rid of it, right? So let's just say it's a vendor invoice. It got approved, but then it's like, we actually don't need to pay this because we don't need the goods anymore, right? So then you can forget about it. So this is just, like I said, a quick graphical representation of what a workflow might look like inside of Intacct. We're not going to be getting that advanced in this session because I just wanted to point out what you can use with just a single step workflow. So like I've talked with some clients before, and they were under the impression that if they wanted to use the purchasing module, they had to use requisitions, they had to use orders. You don't have to. Really, you can think of purchasing as just a fancy front end into accounts payable. And because of that, you can just utilize a single step workflow where you put in invoices, the invoices get approved, and that's it. So as myself, as the AP person, I'm going to go in and enter a vendor invoice. I'm going to put in a vendor invoice, and I'm going to select my vendor. Most of the time airlines are expensed, but let's just say we have an account with Delta and then we just get an invoice from them when we have something to pay. So all of you should be pretty familiar with transactions, so we're not going to really dig into what each field does. And so what I'm going to do is notice that there's an attachments field here. And then I have a folder with some supporting documents. So depending on how many attachments you're putting on there and how large they are, it may be instantaneous, or it might take a couple seconds in this case, because I'm attaching a handful of images. Now, when I look at my attachments, I can see I attached three individual JPEGs for this particular transaction. So this is the point I was making earlier, where you can drag and drop several files onto an attachment with a single drag and drop operation. So if you didn't know you could do that, now you know. Okay, proceeding on here. Let's just say this is for continuing education. I assign it to a fund, and then I'm going to assign it to the education department. Now, really quick here, I'm going to show under the education department, look who my manager is. My manager is employee record 14, which is approver 1. So if we have a little bit of time at the end, we can talk about how employees work inside of Intacct, because they are a different thing than users. But under department ID 110 here. That's the manager. Approver 1 is the manager. So once approver 1 gets that request sent to them, they're going to be able to approve it. So let's go ahead and just fill out the rest of these things. And we'll just say if it's for $500. Okay, so now the transaction is complete. One of the things that changes when you have approvals enabled inside of Intacct is instead of seeing post as an option here, it's going to change to submit, which it doesn't always mean that it needs approval, but it just says that it may need approval. So I'm going to go ahead and select submit here. I'm going to hit submit there. Oh, I had my email closed out. I had my email closed out. Let's see if I can, if I get an email from there. Okay. There we go. Okay. So every time something gets put in your queue, you get a notification that says, hey there, approver, you have something to approve. Here's the person who requested it. Here's the date that was submitted. Here's the vendor. Here's the amount. And if there's a message, it's going to have a message. Yep. So that got submitted. And me as approver 1, the first thing I see when I log in is I'm going to see this approval dashboard right in front of me with all the things I need to approve. So there we go. I see the one for Delta Airlines. It was for $500. I'm ready to approve it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this magnifying glass that says View All. And it's going to pretty much give me the exact same thing, except it gives me a live hyperlinks to drill down into the transaction, approve it or decline it, things like that. One thing I will point out, I'm not going to be doing it, but theoretically you could just select everything and mass approve or mass decline them. But in this case, we want to be a little bit more detailed. We want to look into each transaction, right? So for the one for Delta, I'm going to go in and view it. And me as the approver, I can see, okay, yeah, it's a date. I see the date, I see the vendor. Okay, the general ledger coding looks good. But then I'm going to go into the attachment here. And then I'm going to take a look at my attachments. Well, wait, whoa, well, what's this? Well, okay, so these obviously are not, proper document attachments. So I'm going to decline this and say, you did not attach the appropriate, you did not attach the appropriate documents. Please attach and resubmit. I'm going to decline this. I decline it. It's no longer in my queue. I go back to myself as the AP person, and I'm going to refresh my screen. And I see that this bill right here was declined. So I'm going to go back in and edit it. And then I look into it and I'm like, and then maybe as the AP person, I'm like, oh shoot, I accidentally copied some things that aren't actually related to the transaction. And I just got a notification saying, hey there, AP person, your vendor invoice that you submitted has been declined. And it will tell you what the transaction is and what the comments were from the person who declined it. So I'm like, okay, fine, I'll attach the correct documentation this time. There we go. I actually see something from Delta. So that's probably what I should have attached in the first place. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit submit now again. That submits. I go in as the approver. I go back into the one for $500. Okay, there we go. Much better. Much better. Now I have a Delta bill that actually makes sense. So I went through the bill. I know it's kind of redundant, but I got another notification saying it needs my approval again. But now the attachment is good. I'm going to hit approve, and I'll say looks good. Okay, so when I transact this thing, okay, yeah. So here's a little thing where it did not come up during a test run of this, because looks like the account number I selected requires a restriction or a class. So I'm just going to very quickly decline that and get that fixed. And then, because I want to be able to show you the full audit trail records that are kept on here. My apologies for that. Okay. Now, hopefully when we hit approve, we say looks good. That got approved. It's out of my queue. If I go back in as the AP person, I now see it's in a pending state, which means that it's available for me to pay. But if I go into edit, and once again, this is something that is kept as part of the transaction for eternity, right? Even if you're a super admin, even if you're like a developer, you cannot delete out these audit trail events. You just can't. So when you utilize any type of approval in the system, there should be a link that says approval history on it. In this case, it's under the history tab for the vendor invoice. If I click on that, it shows me each and every step that happened from where this, it shows every single decline and every single approval of this bill, as well as all the comments. So if this would have gone back and forth 100 different times, you would see 100 different lines right here. So that is, I know I kind of rushed through there, but in the interest of time, I wanted to make sure I got to everything. I do see that we have a couple questions, or at least I saw a couple questions initially.
The question was posed and then the user said that you answered it.
Oh, okay, perfect. Very good. Okay, so that's just a very quick view into what you can do with a very basic implementation of Intacct purchasing. Now, it's super simple. Like I said, this was a pretty simple workflow that we set up. You can get really complex, multi-step, multiple transaction types, multi-step approvals, things like that. But really, a little goes a long way. And when it comes to these type of things, and this is definitely something that I think you ought to consider putting in your own company if you haven't done so already. Just looking to maybe we can end exactly on time here. So this demonstration was just with plain core Intacct, no additional subscription at all. Everything is included. If you want something that may be more advanced on the AP automation side that has like machine learning, OCR reading of invoices where it's looking at like an email address, picking up PDFs and then doing its best to enter data into your system. There's AP automation vendors out there. Use is one of them. Stamply is another similar one as well. Most of these do include some type of check issuing service. So that gets the check issuing out of your court and into the third party's court. So even though it might technically be paper, it's not your paper you have to deal with. So that's certainly an option. And then for paperless payments, you can, if you're a fan of American Express, you can utilize an integration with American Express, their credit card, their corporate credit card program, where you can pay all your items with credit card from Intacct. If you have Wells Fargo, you have some wire and ACH capabilities. And then Intacct also has a check delivery service where you still process everything the same as you do in Intacct, but it's just, and checks still get sent to your vendors, but Intacct handles it for you. It goes to their site and they process the checks for you. Definitely, if you have follow-up questions about particulars when it comes to setting up this stuff, once again, feel free to send us off a note. Otherwise, there's a lot of help out there on the Help Center for you as well. Thank you for joining today's webinar. If you have the desire to learn more about Intacct and some of the services that we can help offer you, we do try to put out monthly webinars called CPE for Lunches. Those are free. They are similar topics to what we talked about today. And if you want, they are good for CPE as well. So for the folks on here who like to stock up on CPE or are trying to get their last few hours of CPE before their reporting period ends, definitely keep an eye out on our events page for those coming up. So once again, thank you everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your day and have a fantastic weekend.